In a recent video, I converted this 90s Gary Fisher mountain bike into a modern gravel bike. As part of that, I modified the frame to use hydraulic disc brakes. I got a lot of questions in the comment section of that video about what was required to make those modifications, how I knew to design the disc brake mount, and how I knew that it wouldn't buckle a chainstay. In today's video, we're going to take a look at what was required to modify this frame for disc brakes, and I'm going to answer some of those questions. If that interests you, stay tuned. We'll get started. All right. There's really only two things we have to modify on this frame to install disc brakes. The first, and probably the most difficult, we have to make a bracket and weld it in place to carry the rear caliper. The second, much easier, we have to modify the cable stops and add mounts so that we can attach a hydraulic brake hose. I'm going to start first with the rear caliper mount. I'm going to use an ISO mount. That will let me fit either post mount or flat mount calipers using the appropriate adapter. To figure out where the mount goes, I use a mechanical caliper and crank the pads down so that it bites onto the rotor. That way it's locked in place and I can rotate the wheel to figure out where it needs to go. I've already fitted a post mount adapter to this caliper. I'm going to install the caliper so it sits roughly at the top of the rotor, something kind of like that. I will have to remove this rear rack mount. It's right in the way of where I need to weld on the tabs. I marked the location of where the ISO mount needs to sit. I found this 3/16 inch piece of steel that I think will work really well. I want it to come up and sort of follow that angle of the dropout, so I think I'll cut the edge here kind of like that. And then we've got the two holes for mounting the adapter. I want this end to look pretty much exactly like this, but follow the angle of the rotor, so we'll do something like that. And then when the caliper is mounted, the body sticks down. So I'm going to need to add some clearance for that caliper body. I want to do the same thing on the bottom side. These two are at different angles, and I think that if I also cut a relief here, that will make it easier to weld in place. So we're going to make something that looks kind of like this. Let's go over to the mill, we'll get it made. So that's how that turned out. It is in exactly the right place for the ISO standard. 40 millimeters center to center and 78 millimeters center to center on the front. I added some spacers between the bracket and the mount to move the mount outward. I did that so it would line up with the center of the dropout. I will have to use spacers between the mount and the bracket later when we put it together. I've got the brake mount sitting here exactly where I want it. I am going to put a couple tack welds in it to hold it to the frame. I'm going to do it while everything's together to make sure it's properly aligned. I've added some cardboard to try and keep weld spatter off the wheel and the tire. There's a braze joint right here, and if I run a weld through that, it will vaporize that brass and will ruin the weld. It'll ruin the dropout. So to try and keep heat out of that, I've added this vice grip here just to act as a heat sink. So I'm going to put a couple welds, one tack weld here and one tack weld here, and that will just hold it together, and then I'll fully weld it. All right, so that's the mount after welding. I haven't cleaned it up. It's still covered in spatter. What I wanted to point out here is you can see the discoloration where the heat affected the metal. That braze joint didn't get hot enough to discolor. So if it didn't get hot enough to discolor, it didn't get hot enough to melt, it didn't get hot enough to be damaged. So I'm really happy with how this looks. I'm going to clean it up with a cut brush. So check that out. The wheel's bolted on with the through axle. And the caliper works great. The alignment is spot on. I didn't have any trouble centering the caliper. I'm happy with the way everything looks. So now that this is done, the next thing to do is clean up the frame, get it ready to paint. The paint on this frame is surprisingly high-end. It uses a candy finish, so it's a yellow base coat followed by a translucent red, then decals in clear. Matching that finish is going to be near impossible unless I do it exactly the same way. For that same reason, instead of painting the dropouts in the new ISO mount orange, trying to match the finish, I decided to paint them black. The decals on this frame are black and gold, and I decided to carry that paint scheme through the rest of the frame. I'm using automotive grade spray paint for the finish on this frame. This is a two-part system, so it's a base coat and then a 2K clear. This is just GM black, it's something I had on hand. The clear, this is SprayMax Glamour Clear 2K, so it's a catalyzed paint. You pop a cartridge on the inside, shake it, and it mixes the paint together, and then it catalyzes. I'm using one of these 180mm ISO mount adapters for the rear brake. I noticed during assembly that the face is not perfectly square to the side, so I mounted this in the mill and I very lightly skinned the upper surface so that it was flat. These copper washers I used, they're just there for cosmetics. I think they look really good against the black paint. I originally attached the brake hose to the frame using some of these cable guide adapters. I really wasn't happy with that. The hose didn't fit very well, it looked really sloppy, and it covered up the decals on the frame. So instead, I modified the cable guide stops so that they would hold the brake hose. I installed a pair of these rivet-on brake hose mounts. This gave me 4 mounting points for the hose. It aligned the hose with where the original cable went, and it kept it off the decal. These SLX calipers work well with the Ultegra levers, and they have really good feel and stopping power. These 160mm rotors I used are the perfect size for this setup. There were several questions in the comment section for this build video that I'd like to talk about. I think the most common question I got on the video was why I didn't add a brace between the stays. There was a lot of concern about this stay buckling under braking load. I think the best way to show you what the loading on these stays is actually to model the frame, do some FEA, and we'll look at the factors of safety, we'll look at the forces on the stay, and we'll look at how much it displaces. To calculate the forces on the rear brake mount, I used a force balance methodology that I found in a couple of peer-reviewed papers on the topic. I provided a link to those papers in the description in case you want to do these calculations yourself. Let's take a quick look. I want to show you the assumptions I used, and then we'll put my numbers into the model. We'll see what happens. So if we take a look at the bike and we take a look at the back wheel, the first assumption is that we're only using the rear brake. So 100% of the braking force is done by the rear brake. The second assumption is that there is no slipping between either the wheel and the road or between the pad and the rotor. When we look at the mount, it looks something kind of like this. I am assuming that all of the braking force on that rear brake mount is applied to the mounting holes. And I'm assuming that it's half, so each mounting hole carries half of the load. Using my body weight, the weight of the bike, and the bike's geometry, I calculated that the force on that mount is a total of 984 newtons. So we're going to apply half of that load to each mounting hole. So let's switch over to the model. We'll put these numbers in, and I want to show you the FEA. I built a 3D model of the frame in SolidWorks. This is a really old version of SolidWorks. It's about 20 years old, but it'll do what we want it to do. This version of SolidWorks includes an application called Cosmos Express that will let us do FEA on that rear mount. I've already set this up with that load that we talked about. So this is that 984 newtons that I calculated. When we run that analysis, it comes back with a factor of safety of 2.98. So if we take a look at the displacement model, this will show us a highly exaggerated view of how this frame deforms when that load is applied. Most of the deflection caused by that force is carried on this upper chainstay. Now this is highly exaggerated, 665 times. That red spot has only moved 0.163 millimeters. So keep that in mind when you look at this. It's a very small deflection, highly exaggerated for us to see. I want to take a look at this again, but I'm going to add a brace in this location and I want to see how it performs. All right, so this is exactly the same model, but I've added this little brace here to help carry the load between the two stays. When this one is run, we get a factor of safety of 3.495, or roughly 3.5. So if we look at the displacement model, you can see in this case that same red point moved 0.117 millimeters. You can see that that resulted in some deflection of the lower stay as the force is carried down through that brace and into both stays. We've seen that adding a rear brace does increase the strength and rigidity of the rear mount. There are a couple of downsides though. Adding that brace requires more welding, so we run the risk of either warping the stays or melting or damaging the original brace joints. The second is that adding that brace there is going to reduce access to the rotor and to the hub in this location. So washing and maintenance will be a little bit more difficult. If you're doing this and you're unsure whether to add the brace, if you're confident in your ability to weld this without overheating the stays or the braze joints, and if you're okay with the reduced access, the strength and increased rigidity that that brace offers is well worth it. You should add the brace. So clearly I did not add a brace. I did that because I knew this was going to be strong enough, and I like the way it looks without a brace a lot better. Another common question I got is, why do this? There's nothing wrong with rim brakes. And that's absolutely true. I own several rim brake bikes and I've never had a problem with their stopping power. But my goal with this project was to build a modern gravel bike with drop bars, 700C wheels, large tires, low gearing, disc brakes, and through axles. That is the bike I want to build. For me, this modification is a must-do when converting one of these 90s mountain bikes into a gravel bike. It allows you to run modern hydraulic group sets, and the improved braking performance, especially when wet or muddy, is well worth it. For my next bicycle build project, I'm going to convert this 90s Kona Hahana frame into a modern 650B gravel bike. This project will also include through axles and disc brakes. I learned a lot on the Gary Fisher project, and I'm going to apply that to this frame. If you're not subscribed to my channel and this kind of thing interests you, well, consider subscribing so when I get this done, you'll know about it. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.